Leuk dat jullie kijken naar alweer de 6e livestream in een maandelijkse serie georganiseerd door het Logos Instituut. Logos is een Nederlandse organisatie met 4 werknemers momenteel die congressen, lezingen en dergelijke organiseert en graag het gesprek aangaat over wetenschap en geloof, schepping en evolutie. En om te laten zien dat de wetenschappelijke feiten in te passen zijn in een bijbelgetrouw model. Deze serie van livestreams, hierin komen Nederlandse en internationale wetenschappers en deskundigen aan het woord. Deze avond hebben wij een livestream met Nathaniel Jeanson. Hij is een Amerikaanse bioloog. Hij heeft een doctoraat behaald in cel- en ontwikkelingsbiologie aan Harvard Universiteit. En hij is vandaag vanuit Kentucky met ons via een internetverbinding. Zal hij een presentatie geven. Na de presentatie mag ik hem interviewen. Dat zal ik niet zelf doen met alleen maar mijn eigen vragen, maar ook jullie kunnen vragen stellen. Die kunnen jullie invoeren via de chat op YouTube of Facebook, waar je deze livestream maar volgt. En dan zal ik die vragen eventueel vertalen naar het Engels, als ze in het Nederlands gesteld zijn. Dat mag, maar je mag ze ook in het Engels stellen. En ze aan Dr. Jeanson voorleggen. Mijn eigen naam is Ruby Joortsma. Ik heb een levenslange interesse in de hele discussie over schepping en evolutie. Vandaar dat het Logos Instituut mij weer gevraagd heeft om deze livestream te hosten en achteraf het interview te doen met Dr. Jeanson. So, I'll switch to English now. Dr. Jeanson, thank you for joining us tonight. Well, you've written a new book. A couple of years ago, I see behind you Replacing Darwin, and now this year you published a new book, Traced. And I take it that this presentation is going to be about the content of your new book, correct?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for the opportunity to present and for the invitation. And yes, the focus will be heavily on previewing and exploring the content and ramifications of the research in this new book, Traced.
This new book, is it already published? Is it already available for purchase?
The first printing became available in the second week of March. We sold out of the first printing very quickly.
Great.
Because of COVID-related delays, the second printing should be available sometime mid to end of June, and then the third printing by August. The e-book is currently available for relatively immediate download, and I know they're very close to releasing an enhanced audiobook as well. So they had a professional reader record the audio of the text, and then the enhanced part will be the center section of the book. This 235 color plates, this fat middle part right here, and all that will be available for someone to look alongside as they're listening to the text itself.
Right. Well, I myself bought the e-book, so no problems with shipping. Great to hear that there's an audiobook actually, because I like to listen to scientific lectures and all that when I'm on the road. Too bad about the 235 pictures though. That's going to be a bit difficult while driving. But, well, once again, great that you can join us. I'd say go ahead with your presentation, and then afterwards we'll see each other again and I'll ask you some questions.
Thank you. And as I'm trying to get this shared, I want to say ahead of time, apologies in advance. I've been fighting 2 sinus infections over the last 5 weeks or so. So if I have to pause and take a drink of my water or a cough, I'll try to mute my mic. But hopefully that, by the Lord's grace, we won't have to do much of that. And this will go smoothly.
science is exceeding the demands that the evolutionary community has put on creation science for the last several decades, and taking the lead in science. And I bring this up because, and I'll return to this point at the end, there were specific predictions I made in this book as it relates to human history that are now coming true. But again, thinking about the larger perspective, what I want you to walk away with tonight, hopefully, is that creationists are now making major scientific discoveries, ones that write not just new chapters, but whole new volumes for human history. So this is a watershed moment in the creation evolution debate where, and we might be able to talk about some of the responses of the critics in the Q&A time, but where you're seeing from the critics, even by their responses, that this is now taking the community by a surprise. They don't know how to respond to this. And to be now in a state where creationists are not just playing defense, but going on offense. And what I mean is not just defending themselves from evolutionary attacks, not just saying, hey, but here's where you're wrong too, but going ahead and saying, no, we're making new discoveries about the world that other views cannot make. We're now in the lead in science, in this discipline of human history and the history of peoples. So this is I think, a very unique moment, and I want hopefully this will become clearer as we go along. That's the bigger picture point I'd like to make and hope you walk away with. There are about 9 specific points that I'd also like you to walk away with. And to put this in another framework, to use another metaphor, we've been calling the research that Traced contains the new Rosetta Stone of human history. Rather audacious claim, but I think it's legitimate, not because I'm behind it or because I wrote it. But if you think about what the original Rosetta Stone of human history was, think back to 1799 when it was discovered, about 35 miles outside of Alexandria. At that time in history, just a few centuries ago, the world was aware of Egypt. They were aware of the ancient Egyptian ruins. They were aware that there was once a great civilization. But one of the biggest mysteries was what the Egyptians themselves said about their own past. And we knew there were these hieroglyphic writings in which the Egyptians talked about their own past, but no one could read them. All this changed as a result of this discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which was a literal stone that had 3 types of writing on it. They had the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. They had a form of Egyptian cursive writing called demotic. And then last, and definitely not least, perhaps the most important part, was there was also Greek script. And the world could read Greek at that time, and being able to compare Greek words and find their equivalent in the hieroglyphics was a key stepping stone towards uncovering what the ancient Egyptian writing said, and opened up a whole new window into the past. And hopefully what you'll see as we go along this evening, or whatever time it is where you're watching, is that these new discoveries that creation scientists are making give us huge new windows, not just into Egypt's past, but into the past of the entire world. I'm going to focus on Egypt for the first half or 40 minutes or so to make a larger point so that we can see and experience some of these major new discoveries that creationists are making. And then I'll go rather quickly through the last 8 points, just so you have a sense for what else is going on as a result of all this. And also ways you might be able to personally participate in future research and help uncover some of the rest of the story of human history. So let's begin by considering a historical question that I never had an answer to growing up in school. My last history class that I took was in high school. So this in the United States would be last 4 years before university. And took world history, I took United States history. And one thing that bothered me was the question of who, the peoples of history. We would learn, let's say, for example, Egypt was founded at a certain date, and that lasted for however many centuries or millennia, and then was overthrown at another date. And what was never answered in history class was the before and after of all that. For example, who did the ancient Egyptians come from before they founded their civilization? And if you think back to history class, you might say, well, that's easy. They're a cradle of civilization. They're there from the beginning. And in a sense, that answers the question. In another sense, it does not, because you can just ask the question and bump it back one step further. Where were they? What were they doing before they founded the cradle of civilization? And if you're a creationist, and I don't expect all of you to be creationists, and if you're not, welcome as well, especially to you. But if you're a creationist, the question then becomes, well, how do you go from the cradle of civilization back to the Tower of Babel, back to the flood? What happens in between there? Or if you're not a creationist, it's an even bigger question. Now, I'm going to answer these with scientific answers that are grounded in creation for reasons I'll describe later. But this is one half of the question that nagged me since my high school days, so for several decades. Who did these people come from? And then the other side of that equation, the other half of that equation, is what happened to these peoples after they were overthrown? Are modern Egyptians, the descendants of these ancient peoples? Are they still with us to this day? That question may not be as simple as it first sounds once you start walking your way through Egyptian history, the whole span of it. And I want to do that very quickly, just so you get a sense for how non-intuitive the answer to this question is, and how many surprises might be in store for us if we start to dig into it. So let's consider very briefly the major romanticized era of Egyptian history, the part with the pharaohs and the Sphinx and the pyramids and all that gold. That was a largely African segment of Egyptian history. The pharaohs were largely African. Of course, geographically, I'll use my laser pointer here, the Egyptian civilization was known as the one astride the Nile, which of course, this is technically geographically Africa. And the modern Egyptian state, of course, is still African in that sense, Northeast African, but African nonetheless. There were times in this ancient era of Egyptian history when non-Africans ruled. You can think of the time when Asians, such as the Hyksos, interrupted the kingdoms of the ancient Egyptians. And the kingdoms I'm talking about were the eras known as the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. These are African eras. And the pharaohs, when I say African, do not necessarily have to be Egyptian. They could be Libyan, they could be Kushite, but they are African nonetheless. You have African dynasties that reemerge. And when you think of the major landmarks, the Valley of the Kings, the Great Pyramids of Giza, these are pharaohs who rule and order the construction of these things that are African in origin. The hieroglyphic language is an African language. Their religious practices, you think of all those deities that they worship, those are African in nature. That African civilization undergoes a major shift beginning with the arrival of the Assyrians in the 600s BC. This map shows the successive expansion of the Assyrian state from its beginnings here, and the various colors show as it through the years and centuries became larger and larger and larger. For our purposes, the important part is down here in the lighter blue-green, and then the blue right here. This is about the lighter teal. Blue-green is 675 BC approximately, and then the darker blue here is 650 BC. That's when the Assyrians come in and overthrow, I think it's the 25th dynasty. And this is essentially the beginning of the end for the ancient African state. You do have African rebellions against the Assyrians that follow this, but these would not last. Eventually, the Persians roll in and conquer Egypt in 525 BC. Once again, the Africans attempt to rebel against Persian rule, but the ultimate end of this African pharaonic era happens when Alexander the Great, a European, marches in, and his successors, and of course their Roman conquerors, the successors, sit on the throne of Egypt as pharaohs, but by this time that whole system is now at an end. These European rulers are eventually overthrown by Asian ones again in the 600s AD. Muhammad and his followers march out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquer parts of 3 continents. Of course, they're in Asia originally. Then they conquer parts of Africa, North Africa, including Egypt. And also you can see here on this map, rule parts of Spain for centuries. The years that follow see other Asian conquerors. Some of them are Turkic. One of the last conquering, ruling reigns in Egypt were the Ottoman Turks, again of Asian origin. You can see the map of the growth of their kingdom from its beginnings right here in the 1300s and successively into Europe and down into Egypt and Africa. And this, of course, brings us all the way up into the time of World War I. And if you were to go to Egypt today, and perhaps you have, you'll, of course, be struck by the language, which is Arabic, due to the Muslim conquest. And, of course, the religion, Muslim, Islam, once again, due to the Asian, Arab, Muslim conquest. What you see today is all the absence of things today is also what you might notice. Today's Egyptian rulers don't build pyramids to themselves. They don't talk of the ancient African religions. If you're in Egypt today, there's a strongly Asian flavor, not an African one. And so let's return to that question of what happened to the ancient Egyptian people. Are modern Egyptians the descendants of the people of this great civilization, or did they simply melt away into all the conquering nations thereafter? Perhaps they're extinct. What we want to do for the next several minutes is use the tool that we're calling this new Rosetta Stone of human history. It's a DNA-based, generation by generation, family tree for global humanity. And the tree I'm showing you here is based on the DNA that is inherited from fathers to sons. It's the Y chromosome. It's found only in males. And again, it's only males that pass it on. And the way this principle works and how we can generate a family tree from this male inherited DNA is probably best understood by analogy to a traditional family tree. Perhaps you've not reflected on what a traditional family tree shows. Perhaps your family has tried to come up with your ancestors. In my own family, my father has tried to trace our ancestry back. My mother is German. My dad is from the United States. And we've gotten back to, I think, in certain parts, the great-great-great-grandparents, not terribly far, but through historical records and what our relatives have said and such, we've tried to reconstruct this. Well, embedded in such a family tree are two critical pieces of information, which again, we take for granted just glancing. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. I'll proceed now with what we were saying. Let me just back up a slide so we can jump back into this. So we're thinking about the question of what happened to the ancient Egyptians as well as who they came from. And the tool we're going to try to answer this, and really the main focus of my new book, Traced, and of the research in it, and of the research going forward, Lord willing, for the rest of my life, is this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity. And I want to think again, just to make sure we're all on the same page and make sure we didn't lose anything because of the sound technical difficulties, how DNA can record a family tree history. And if we think about our traditional family trees, there's two elements within them that we take for granted, but it's helpful to enumerate exactly what a traditional family tree shows, to think about how a DNA sequence can record family tree history. And the first thing that the family tree shows, at least a traditional family tree, is I can say to you, based on what my dad has recorded and what my relatives have told us, David is my dad, Ingrid is my mom. I can give you the name of my grandfather, my grandmother on my dad's side, grandfather, grandmother on my mother's side, and all that identity information, the who of my family tree is present in a traditional family tree, and perhaps yours shows the same thing, if you've been able to trace it back. The second element is already embedded in the words I just used. So when I say father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-grandfather, there's an implicit time element. I'm telling you how many generations ago this specific ancestor lived. So the who, or the ancestor information, and the time element, those two things are the key elements of a traditional family tree. And those two elements, are the two things DNA can record. The first element, I think we're already all familiar with. We already know let's say in cases of unknown paternity, you use DNA to identify who the dad is. Or if you've been adopted, you know that you can take a DNA test to try to find your biological relatives, your biological parents. So that's fairly straightforward. DNA records who, and if you're looking at the DNA in this case, so this particular family tree, and the focus of the book, and what we're going to focus on for the next several minutes, is the DNA inherited through males, the Y chromosome, passed on from fathers to sons. So if you test a Y chromosome, you're trying to say, who did I come from in terms of my paternal ancestry? Who is my father? Who's my grandfather? Well, how does the Y chromosome, how does DNA record time? And again, I'm going to give an answer in terms of the Y chromosome, because this is the focus of the book and will be now of our time together. Well, fathers pass it on, and so fathers pass on DNA through their sperm cells. Sperm cells have to copy the father's DNA. Otherwise, what's dad going to have? So they copy whatever DNA dad has, or in this case, they copy the Y chromosome that's present in dad. And this process of reading and copying the Y chromosome DNA is imperfect. Mistakes occur every generation. For Christians, this is not surprising. We live in a fallen world. We would say theologically, it's not the perfect world that God created. It's been broken and marred because of sin and because of God's judgment on sin specifically. And so mistakes happen. On average, about 3 mistakes occur per generation. So if you were to compare my Y chromosome to one of my son's Y chromosomes, you'd probably find about 3 differences. If you were to compare my son's Y chromosome to my father's, his grandfather's, you should see about 6 differences between them. And if you go back another generation, about 9 differences and 12. And so the number of differences is a marker of time. If you were to compare my Y chromosome to any of you males listening, and if we were watching, and if we were to count up the number of differences between our Y chromosomes, we could get a sense for how long ago our common male ancestor lived. So those are the principles behind what you're seeing here on the screen right now. DNA records the who of human history. That's straightforward. It also records the timing. This particular DNA tree that you're looking at is based on the Y chromosomes from about 600 men from around the globe. From Europe, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. You've got people from New Guinea. You've got Native Americans. It's a fairly representative sample of the global family tree. You can also see there's various colors. The colors are to highlight the various branches. The branches are given labels that you see here, combinations of letters and numbers. The scheme for this that the scientific community has chosen are somewhat straightforward, but not always intuitive. For deep branches on the tree, for example, in yellow here, you might not be able to see the details, but there's a long branch that goes all the way back here. And by the way, time moves from top to bottom. N in yellow represents one particular branch. And then over here in dark blue is O. Over here, you've got in royal blue, I, arbitrary letter of the alphabet. And on this side, J. Well, J further subdivides into these green over here and these sort of light blue right here. So this is J1, J2. You can see over here, Q in pink. And then its brother group is R. R divides into R1, R2. R1 further subdivides into light purple here, R1A, and then green, brown, R1B. And you can get very long names that of letter number combinations that are not pretty, but they tell you at a glance exactly where you are in the tree. We're going to focus on the section, we're going to begin our focus on a section that is abundant in Egyptian men. There is no branch of the tree that exists in a majority of Egyptian men. So that fact alone tells you that modern Egyptians represent a mix of peoples, which shouldn't be surprising in light of the history that we covered right before the technical difficulties, where I talked about invader after invader after invader ruling Egypt and bringing foreign DNA among the Egyptian peoples. E1b1 B exists in more than 40% of Egyptian men. Everything else, all the other branches, exist at lower percentages. So if you figure out that math in your head, you'll realize there's a lot of diversity, genetic diversity within modern Egypt. Let's begin thinking about E1b1B, not by zooming in the branch on that branch yet. I'll do that in a moment, but by observing where else in the globe E1b1B exists today. That's what this map represents. The size of the circles is a measure of the relative abundance of E1b1B in any particular location. And if there's no circle, what that means is E1b1B exists in less than 1% of the men or is undetectable. So you can see out here in East Asia, you don't see any circles. Out here in Siberia. I've omitted E1b1B from the Americas because Native Americans do not belong to E1b1B. You do have E1b1B in the Americas because Europeans came over. So you can see there's E1b up here in Spain, Italy, the Balkans, France, Germany, and such. And because it's known to have arrived due to recent colonialism, I've omitted it from the map. We're trying to look at indigenous history. So this circle, I said, is a little bit more than 40%. This larger circle down here in Somalia, I think their number, about 77% of their men belong to E1b1B. Again, you can see that these large circles exist up here in North Africa, and then medium-sized circles down here, Sudan, Ethiopia. I think these are the Maasai of Kenya, Tanzania, and it drops as you go down in Africa. There's also circles in Europe, but they're fairly small, exist at low levels. If you step back for a moment and look at the larger picture of where E1b1B exists and where it does not, it reminds me of a map of a political conquest. One of the conquests that's relevant to the history of ancient Egypt, that of the Arab Muslims in the 600s AD. The Arab Muslims, when they came out of the Arabian Peninsula, made it all the way over here into Central Asia, up to the border of India. They did not successfully conquer India. They got into Turkey, they got into North Africa, they got into Europe. Spain, that's it basically, in France, no further. But, and you probably already know this, being in Europe, this was a surprise to me, being an American. I've learned that even mainstream historians recognize that the nation states as they now exist, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, did not exist as nation states prior to the 1500s or so. And if in my book Traced, I've got a quote from a mainstream historian where he says essentially that. Yes, you have political domains and countries, so to speak, but he says these represent simply the land tracts over which monarchs viewed the extent of their rule, and it said very little about the actual identity of the people under their rule. And my point in saying all that is, the Arabs arrived in Europe centuries before the 1500s, which means then, once you get some sort of genetics into Europe before that point, there's a high chance it can be distributed throughout the rest of Europe in the centuries following. And that's, I think, what we see here. So my point is, where E1b1B exists today, Europe, high in North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, into Central Asia, but not India, all that seems to slightly resemble the conquest of the Arab Muslim armies. Perhaps there's a link. Obviously, the overlap is not perfect. The Arab Muslims did not go conquering all the way down here into South Africa or necessarily into Somalia, but there's enough of a match where it would be worth exploring this further. And that's what we're going to do now. And we're going to do it by taking step 2, looking at the details of this branch. So I'm going to zoom in right here on E1b1B and rotate it 90 degrees so we can read the labels better, so you don't have to crane your neck. And this is what it looks like. And if you can't read all the names, up here on this red branch are almost exclusively Mozabites. Mozabites are, I think, they're a community here in Algeria. So they're, in a sense, they're representative of the North African branch. There's others here. There's Bedouins from, I think these are perhaps the West Bank. There's Bantus speaking peoples from South Africa, Bantu speakers from Kenya. There's some Europeans like Sardinians from Sardinia. Again, more Africans, Mandinka from West Africa. the Basque peoples of the French-Spanish boundary, Druze from the Middle East, Tuscany, so Italians from Tuscany, French, Palestinians, Bedouin, and then a few Pakistanis here as well, the Balochi. That's some of the details. Let's step back again and first evaluate the larger picture. One of the first dates that I've assigned here, and by the way, these dates are all derived within a young Earth framework. I've looked at this entire tree, in other words, this right here, and I've said from this point right here down to the tips right here, down right here, we can talk about these long branches at another point, or down to these tips right here for E1b1 A, represents just 4,500 years since the flood. We'll talk about why or why not this may be true later, but I want you to know that the branches we're seeing, the dates that we're assigning to the branches that we're seeing are within that framework, and you'd get very different dates if you were to use the mainstream scientific framework of hundreds of thousands of years of human history. All that's relevant because one of the points of my book is to show that you can see the clear echoes of human history in our DNA, but only when you have the young Earth scientific framework. This is one of the fulfilled testable predictions from my book, Replacing Darwin. So one of the first dates I show here, where you have one long branch and then it multiplies into 3 branches, and the date for this is around the 300s to 600s AD. This is a critical clue to further evaluating our hypothesis as to whether or not E1b1 A did in fact represent and correlate with the migrations of the Arab Muslim armies. Was E1b1 B one of the lineages that was present in the Arabian Peninsula and carried by the Arab Muslim armies wherever they went conquering? Well, to answer that question, I want to step back for a moment and think about what family tree branches record. It's not necessarily well known. Once you catch what I'm talking about, you'll say, oh, well, of course, it's a kindergarten point. It's a simple point. But let me make it clear. And I want to do it by making or using as an example a probably familiar biblical example to Christians and creationists, that of the Old Testament nation of Israel. Jacob and his 12 sons, if we were to draw their male family tree, you'd have at the top in this generation, Jacob, and then of course his 12 boys down here. Okay, what's the point of this? Well, if you take away the names, you can see that the branches themselves record changes in population size from generation to generation. It goes from 12 to this dramatic expansion, 12 sons, which of course become the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. 2 tribes, of course, coming from Joseph through his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. My basic point is the number of branches on the family tree tells us something about population size. It can, if you're looking at a nuclear family, it can tell you about the changes in population size of the nuclear family. Well, duh, of course, you might say. Now apply this principle around the globe. If you have a sample of individuals from a variety of regions and they connect on the family tree, this can tell you something about their history of their population growth. So let's go back to this part of the tree. Here we've got 1 branch multiplying into 3 branches, and the date for this is around the 300s to 600s. This would seem to suggest there was some sort of population tripling, so to speak, around this era of history, which just so happens to be right around the Arab Muslim conquest. We'll return to the political side of the equation in a moment. What I want to do now, though, is show you the known population history for various regions of the Middle East around this time frame and before and after. So in the next slide here, I'm going to show you the history of population growth for 4 regions. I've broken the Middle East up into 4 regions. Each of these graphs on the horizontal axis goes from 200 BC negative. I've got the year 0 here, even though it doesn't exist. It's just easier to graph in Excel when you include it. 200 BC all the way up to 2000 AD. Same thing here, same thing down here, same thing down here. And on the vertical axis, you have the population size given in millions, 2 million, 4 million, 6 million, and it'll change in terms of numbers, 5 million, 10 million, depending on where you are. Now, these 4 regions, their identities is really what matters in our discussion. And so I want to map out for you exactly what I'm talking about. So I've got the Arabian Peninsula, and then the upper right, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, a whole grouping there together. Then down here, Turkey and Iran. And so what this represents here, the upper left one, the Arabian Peninsula, refers to modern Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, and so forth. The upper right graph refers essentially to the heart of the Middle East, modern Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and so forth. And then Turkey and Iran round out the rest of the Middle East. That's what these graphs correspond to, now that we've got our geographic bearings. I want you to notice, first of all, that each of these graphs has somewhat a hockey stick shape, where it's fairly flat and then shoots upward. Fairly flat, shoots upward in the recent past. Fairly flat, then begins to grow, and then shoots upward. Same thing here. I want to zoom in and kind of eliminate some of that last shooting upward, because the amount of shooting upward is so great, it tends to outshine all that comes prior. So this next slide here shows you the same thing, but we're sort of cutting off that last growth so we can see more of the nuance and detail in the prior years. We've got two graphs. The first graph here, the dotted line, represents the actual history of population growth, ups and downs, ups and downs. Same thing here, decline, rise. The black line is essentially the inferred population curve of the survivors. So the people, let's say in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, who had this large rise in population growth and then decline. Well, the people who died out here didn't leave any descendants. They don't really matter for our purposes, because the DNA we're looking at, I should have mentioned this earlier, the DNA that we're looking at is taken from living men. We take living men, we take their DNA, we compare it. Nearly all of our DNA is identical, so it's pretty easy to find the differences. And then we count the differences, and we use the count of the differences to, again, reconstruct the family tree. The number of differences between any two men is a marker of how long ago they had a common ancestor. So you reconstruct the family tree, then you got the branch numbering, and now we're talking about the question of what does the branch pattern tell us about the history of population growth. And what I want you to see is that the black lines among these four graphs are fairly similar with one exception. So Turkey has a history in black of that's essentially flat, slight uptick right here, and then finally in 1400 it begins this permanent rise. Iran, long history of flat population growth, effectively flat. 1400 rises, flat, and then permanently rises. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, flat for centuries, slight rise, flat, and then late 1800s finally does the permanent rise. The Arabian Peninsula is the exception, where it is not flat for centuries. There is a rise from the BC era all the way up to about Muhammad's time. Then it's effectively flat, then late rises. So it's this fairly ancient period of sustained population growth. And just to give you the numbers, in 200 BC, you have the population size around 1.5 million. By around 500 BC, 500 AD. So from 200 BC, 1.5 million to about 500 AD, which gets you close to 4-ish million. Well, what's 1.5 million times 2? That's 3 million. 3 million plus another 1.5. So 1.5 times 3 would be 4.5. You get from this point all the way up to this point about a threefold change in population size. How interesting. Because this E1b1 B branch shows population tripling, 1 to 3. 1.5 times 3 is 4.5. The math seems to agree here. This marker here of population expansion seems consistent with E1b1b having been in the Arabian Peninsula around the time when Muhammad went expanding. So we hypothesized, based on the geographic distribution of E1b1b, that it seems to roughly correlate with where the Arab Muslim armies went conquering. We can also see, based on the branching structure, that the history of population growth embedded in this branch is also consistent with its origin in the AD 300s to 600s in the Arabian Peninsula. If we had time, we could go through how the E1b1b distribution also has correlations with languages. Arabic belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family. There's a strong correlation between where those languages are found today and where E1b1b exists today. That'll be a third line of evidence. You just have to take my word for it for now. My point is, the branch that currently exists in Egyptians at the highest levels, the most abundant branch in modern Egyptians, is E1b1B. And E1b1B seems to have originated not in Africa, but in Asia, in the Arabian Peninsula. And so this would suggest that the plurality of modern Egyptians does not trace their ancestry back to the pharaohs of old and their people, but to recent conquerors. But this is not the end of the story. It gets rather interesting. If we go back here, you'll notice that the most ancient date I've given you is still the AD era. If you're thinking in a young Earth time frame, that's still thousands of years after the flood. So what happens if you take that branch further back in history? What sort of conclusions arise? Well, the next point in the tree where E1b1B connects is actually not a point for E1b1B, but a point of connection to a whole other section of the tree known as E1b1 A. We'll talk about the dates, the 700s to 400s BC, in a few minutes. First, we're going to explore E1b1 A and its history, figure out how this relates to E1b1B's history, and then revisit the question of what happened to the ancient Egyptians. And along the way, again, this whole concept of young Earth timescale, of creationists making major scientific discoveries, is going to hopefully be prominent once again. The distribution of E1b1A is not quite mutually exclusive, but quite different from E1b1B. E1b1A is the dominant sub-Saharan African lineage today in Nigeria. I think it's in 90% or more of the men. So large circles there. Again, the size of the circle represents the relative abundance. In Africa, there are multiple language families. You can see here in tan is the Afro-Asiatic language family that I had to skip over just a few minutes ago. There's also the Nilo-Saharan here in red. If you think of the very tall, dark-skinned Sudanese, or perhaps the very tall Maasai of Kenya, they speak Nilo-Saharan languages. The Khoisan languages, the Click-speaking languages of the Bushmen, the Khoisan here of Southwest Africa. You might recognize those. What I want to draw your attention to is these yellowish tan languages that cover much of West Africa and Central and Southern Africa. That's the Niger-Congo language family. The Bantu languages are a subgroup. And if we overlay the genetics and the languages, once again, you see a fairly strong correlation. Not a perfect one, a fairly strong one. I want to draw your attention to this subset of Niger-Congo languages I just mentioned, the Bantu ones, because there's a position that the mainstream scientific community holds about this. And I want to give you a quote from a textbook I have here in my office about the history of Africa that has tremendous relevance to what we're going to see momentarily at the genetic level and how the young Earth timescale seems to get things correct. So here's the quote. Kevin Shillington is the author of this book, The History of Africa. He said, before the development of radiocarbon dating and the widespread archaeological research that has taken place since the 1950s, it was believed that Bantu speakers spread across Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa in the comparatively recent past. The main source of evidence was oral traditions, which seldom traced ruling lineages back more than 500 years. So Kevin Shillington is saying, for some time, the mainstream community held to the view that this Bantu expansion, the movement of Bantu languages throughout Africa, and so they'll say that the origin point was probably up here in Nigeria, Cameroon, and then they spread down here into Africa. Kevin Shillington says, we used to think this happened recently, because if you talk to the people who speak Bantu languages, they can only go back in their genealogies a few centuries. And he says, we don't think that anymore. He said, it was assumed, therefore, that to have populated the subcontinent in so short a time, there must have been a large-scale conquering migrations of whole new peoples. He said, because of archaeology, we don't think that anymore. So they're contradicting what the peoples themselves seem to imply. Well, if you look at the E1b1B branches, so just to get our bearings once again, I showed you the geographic distribution in which E1b1A has a geographic correspondence to where Niger-Congo languages exist. If we look at the specific branching structure within E1b1A, nearly all the branches form within the last few centuries. Here, the most ancient branch in this study is that originated in the 1200s to 1400s. I've got these other points right here because I've highlighted in pink the Mandinka Peoples, The Mandinka exist here in far western Africa. And if you think about the geographic orientation of the Bantu expansion, it's thought that the Bantu languages originated somewhere in here and then spread down this way. So I'm saying, well, here's a westernmost anchor point, some of the most ancient branches here, which is not very ancient at all, just a few centuries ago, belong to West African peoples, and the point at which the West Africans branch away from the rest. And the rest here would include, in case you can't read it, Bantus from Kenya, Yorubans from Nigeria, Biaka, Pygmies from Central Africa, Makranis, I think would be Pakistanis, but of East African descent, Mozabites from Algeria, which again, you saw on the map, there are some North Africans. Anyway, South Africa, Yorubans, elsewhere in Africa that's not Western Africa. So the point at which the Western African lineages separate from, let's say, central ones, central southern ones, 14 to 1600s, 1400s. Isn't that interesting? About 500 years ago, 600 years ago, right in line with the oral traditions of the Africans themselves, you see this separation apparently among the West African lineages and the other ones. This all seems to be consistent with what used to be the view of the Bantu expansion, that they originated up here, and that perhaps some people stayed up this way, became part of the West African peoples, others then migrated down this way in the last few centuries according to oral tradition, and then according to the young earth-based time scale for the origin of these branches in the last few centuries. Branching pattern. The dates for these branching events within the mainstream framework are not just a few centuries ago. The mainstream community would say the E1b1 A branch separation events occurred 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. You get a dramatically different history. If you have the mainstream time scale, you get something right in line with oral history when you have the young earth-based framework. So all that to say, long story short, it appears to be that these Bantu languages did originate recently. The genetic echo of this appears to be the E1b1 A branch. And so this would put the origins, and I've sped this up just for sake of time a little bit, the origins of E1b1 A a few centuries ago near West Africa. Now, E1b1 A is a relative. It connects in the family tree to E1b1 B, which we said originated probably in the Arabian Peninsula, or was in the Arabian Peninsula just about 1400 years ago in the 600s AD. Yet these two branches connect, and we'll come back to that more in a moment. I wanted to put on a map everything I've just told you. So E1b1b, we said in the 600s AD was likely somewhere here, so that when the Arab Muslims went expanding, they took E1b1b with them. About 500, 600 years ago, it appears that E1b1 A was up here, perhaps near Nigeria, Cameroon, or perhaps somewhere here in West Africa, before then it started expanding down here into Central and Southern Africa. Okay. Where did the ancestor to E1b1 A and E1b1 B live? Remember, they're both connected. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The straight line passes through Sudan, modern Eritrea. And you can see right down here, there's a very close connection. There is water that separates the world. In the pre-600s AD was the site of a kingdom known as Axum, and Axum connected ancient East Africa to ancient Arabian Peninsula. And so if you ask the question, where was the ancestor of this guy and this guy? Because they're connected, they must have been once in one spot. Most of the candidate regions between them are African. And in fact, there was a kingdom that was African, but connected to the Arabian Peninsula. And so it would seem that the most likely homeland for these guys was African, not necessarily Asian. So yes, the dominant lineage in Egypt today is E1b1b, and we said it traces back to Asia because of the Arab Muslim expansion. But if you go deeper in history, it seems to connect back to Africa itself. And so the Egyptians themselves appear to have been originally African in origin. I'm going to skip a few slides for sake of time in terms of other reasons why, and I go through in the book why I think, in fact, the ancestor of E1b1b and E1b1a was Northeast African. Again, they connect, so they must have been originally in one spot. Who might these people have been? That's what I want to think about now. And think about it with respect to the dates. So I say here, based on the young Earth time scale and the calculation within that framework, that the 700s BC to 400s BC are when these two branches connect. That just so happens to be overlapping an era of history when Egypt was ruled by Africans, not by Egyptians, but by the Nubians. The 25th dynasty of Egypt was the Nubian dynasty. It's roughly 720 BC to about 650s BC. They were the ones overthrown by the Assyrians. So 720s to 650s puts you in the upper end of this range. Strong Northeast African rulers, eventually overthrown by the Assyrians. And the Assyrian event, of course, happens about 650 BC. So when the Assyrians overthrew the Nubians, and if this is indeed part of the Nubian lineage, could this have caused some of them to disperse, some of them to go further south, perhaps east into Ethiopia, Eritrea, modern Ethiopia and Eritrea, where eventually they went over into Yemen and became part of the Arab community, and others to eventually migrate down into sub-Saharan Africa, where they became part of the Bantu expansion. All this evidence together, some of which I've gone over quickly just for sake of time, seems to indicate that E1b1 A and E1b1 B originated up here in northeastern Africa. And this gets us pretty close to ancient Egypt. It may not be the actual Egyptian lineage itself, perhaps the Nubian one, but Egypt and Nubia had so much interaction with each other over the years that it's almost splitting hairs, so to speak, to use an English expression, to try to figure out which one is which. My guess is it's probably through Ham's son Cush, and it is in fact ancient Nubia. But what I've just shown you is that modern Egyptians, even though their immediate ancestry seems to trace to Asia, ultimately still does come from Africa, at least the 40% of the Egyptian men that belong to E1b1b. Okay, so there's my main point. And this extended illustration is designed to show you just one of many examples that we could go through. There is this larger principle. One of the major scientific discoveries that creationists are now making is uncovering the history of the peoples of the ancient world that we learned about in history class. This is something we haven't been able to do because we haven't had this sort of evidence. The mainstream community is somewhat hamstrung in their ability to do this because if you think about the evolutionary timescale, hundreds of thousands of years long, the history of civilization is just the most recent 5,000 years in their view. And so you try to tease out some of these very recent events within an evolutionary framework, you're getting into parts of the tree that have within their framework, a lot of statistical noise. It's almost not worth trying to go look for the echo of these historical events. Yet when we analyze this family tree within a young Earth framework, the history of population growth, the history of political events, all these pieces of history that we know from mainstream history fall into place and just pop out from the tree. So this is one major discovery. So I said, this is my first major point. I had 8 more, which I'm going to do fairly rapid fire. Again, we're calling this the new Rosetta Stone of human history because there are so many large global ramifications for how we understand our past and who we came from. So the who of human history, that's the first major element. The second one I'm going to call prehistory. Now, this is a term that sometimes is referred to like the caveman era. Technically, it simply means pre-written records. And so if you think about the pre-Columbian, pre-European Americas, that would fall into the category of prehistory because so much that was written was either lost or perhaps it was never written down in the first place. I grew up, even though I was in the United States, grew up learning next to nothing about this history. I've learned part of the reason why is just because it's changing so fast. But this research changes it even more because the DNA-based family tree for global humanity within a young Earth framework implies that there were multiple settlings of the Americas by people from Asia even before Europeans arrived. So today's Native Americans were not the first. And there's so much more we could say about this. I've got a whole chapter in the pre-Columbian Americas. It's wild, but it's not the only place on Earth where we can do this sort of analyses. Pre-colonial Africa, pre-colonial Pacific. This Y chromosome-based tree has a lot to say about that as well. And creationists are leading the way in making these discoveries. A third element that emerges from this family tree, you probably can't read the names here, it's not that important. What I've highlighted here in this screen, this slide, this is also from the book, is the Genesis 10 family tree with Shem and his descendants in blue down to generation 6, Japheth and his descendants down to generation 3, Ham and his descendants down to generation 3 and 4. What you can see, I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees so that you can see here, Shem, Japheth, Ham, 3 major branches from Noah. That's exactly what you see at the base of the Y chromosome tree. I don't have time to justify it. Again, there's a whole chapter that does it. Multiple independent pieces of biblical data that line up with multiple independent pieces of Y chromosome data very tightly. It's not just that there's 3 branches, but the number of generations that differ between Shem and Ham show up. You can see what the Bible says about the fates of these various men showing up in a very close manner. What this means practically, again, I don't have time to justify it. What it means practically is every single male, every single people group on earth can, in theory, trace their ancestry back to specific men listed in Genesis 10 because this agreement is so tight. And in fact, and I'm just going to cut to the conclusion real fast. If you think about Ham's descendants, and the Bible seems to indicate that Cush gave rise to some of the Sudanese, Ethiopians, ancient peoples. Mizraim, of course, is translated as Egypt. My best guess for who E1b1 and E1b1 A come from, because I've assigned them to the Hamitic side of the tree, my guess is this is probably Cush rather than Mizraim. So if we're trying to find the fate of the ancient Egyptians, we might still have to look some more to find Mizraim's line himself. But the bigger point I'm making here is that Noah and his boys in the Genesis 10 genealogy finds a facsimile, a replica at the base of the Y chromosome tree. And this is powerful confirmation of the biblical anthropology. And you can read off generation by generation details. One other thing I want to point out here in terms of biblical anthropology is that when you look at Genesis 10, there's a descendant of Shem mentioned, Peleg. And if you go to Genesis 11, we know Peleg's genealogy is taken down. So here's, again, this you just saw on the previous slide along with Peleg. And then Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We've got these generations that we can march off in Scripture, generation by generation. You can see that exact level of detail. Again, I said earlier, this is a generation by generation tree for global humanity. I can count off the generations from Shem down through Abraham's line to what I think is probably Jacob's line, and perhaps some of the tribes of Israel. I've had hundreds of Arabs actually that I've spoken to about this research. And of course, they want to know if they come from Ishmael. And it's made me rethink if these particular branches of the tree, T and L, are through Isaac or through Ishmael. And now in the book, I call it Jewish, but now I'm beginning to reconsider if we need to get some more evidence to decide if it's indeed Ishmael and some of his tribes, or if it's some of the tribes of Israel. Here I'm saying it's Israel. The point is, at a minimum, it is Abrahamic. We can see that genealogical echo, and there's some really interesting historical questions to pursue further. The fifth thing that falls out of this tree, once again, just to reiterate a point I made earlier, but to make it personal, every single male watching can take a Y chromosome test and trace his family line back to specific sons of Noah. What I should clarify is every one of us has multiple male inputs. You take a Y chromosome test, all you're finding out is your unbroken line of male descent. It tells you nothing about your father's mother's side or your mother's father's side, your mother's mother's side. And the way around this, of course, and especially if you're a lady listening, is you find male relatives. Males and females both have to figure out the complexity of their family tree by finding multiple relatives. So if I want to know my dad's mother's side, perhaps I can find her brother, or maybe a cousin of mine or second cousin of mine who has this male descent back to someone on my father's mother's side. We've done this now for my mother's side. We've got my mother's brother to take a Y chromosome test. And we've in fact been doing this for my wife's side of the family tree as well. My father-in-law and my mother's brother have taken Y chromosome tests. And there was a whole Facebook page dedicated to my father's mother's family name and multiple males who had taken Y chromosome tests there. So we can go back to specific individuals. Now, part of the reason I'm bringing this up is, and this is where your participation becomes all the more relevant going forward in the future, the number of names listed in Genesis 10 is around 70. If you were to look at the base of this Y chromosome tree, you do not see 70 lineages. Yet, what I'm going to say here, and it would take some time to explain, so you'll just have to take my word for it for the time being. This is just scratching the surface. 99% of men in the globe or more have yet to take a Y chromosome test. So my guess is those lineages, these peoples of the ancient world who have now been lost, are likely still out there. Their descendants are likely still out there. You may have within your DNA the answer to some of these lost peoples of the ancient world. The Assyrians do not yet have a lineage that's identifiable in this Y chromosome tree. My guess is there are still descendants of the Assyrians. They're at low frequency, I think, which is not surprising given the fact that the Assyrians were conquered 2,600 years ago and have not ruled since then. Conquerors tend to leave the most offspring, most descendants. The last conqueror tends to win. But there's a personal ancestry element to all this. And the other side of this equation is you may have within your DNA the answer to some of these mysteries we're trying to solve going forward. And so if you want to participate in future research, or if you've taken a Y chromosome test and you want to know which son of Noah do I come from, the book has a table. The last color plate is a table for you to identify that. Many of the testing companies don't give you results that are easily understandable. So, any question you have, you can go to this website. It's our homepage /go/traced, TRACAD website down at the bottom of the screen. You can click on this button right here. It'll bring you up to the supplemental materials and how to participate in future research. You click that button, it'll take you down here, first name, last name, email address, message. This goes straight to my inbox. So I've gotten probably 400 messages so far from people around the globe. And this has been really exciting. There's some really interesting projects that are beginning to emerge. Right now, we're just in phase 1 of collecting data that people want to send in or names of participants who want to volunteer. And we'll see where we go from here. 6th point, and again, we'll make these last few points quickly for sake of time. One of the major implications of this research is how it rewrites our understanding of race and ethnicity. So let's use an example from something I just described to you. You can see here up in Scandinavia, there are some small circles, but there are circles nonetheless. That means there are some light-skinned Scandinavians who belong to E1b1 A. And in light of the history that we just discussed, their ancestors going back 1,000 years were probably not Vikings, at least in terms of their Y chromosomes. They probably go back, as we just described the history, back to the Arab Muslims, who were not blonde and blue-eyed and light-skinned, but dark-haired and olive-skinned. And of course, this gentleman's ancestry and family history doesn't stop there. You go back to the BC era, and his ancestors probably were dark-skinned and Nubian-looking. And some of those ancestors themselves may have sat on the throne of Egypt. I'm showing King Tut here, who was not a Nubian, but there are some Scandinavians. There may be some of you watching, because again, it's not just Scandinavia, but elsewhere in Europe. Some of you watching may have ancestry that goes back to royal Egypt. And who would have guessed that? My point in showing you this single example is to illustrate how the so-called races of the globe have changed multiple times in human history. So now you think about that fact in light of the claims that racists make. Well, this race is superior to this race, and this race is inferior to this race. How can you even talk about that in any rational way when the whole concept of race is fluid and has changed multiple times in human history? I'll give you a single example. The book gives many more, where you have people who are dark-skinned today but have had light-skinned ancestors, people who are light-skinned today who have dark-skinned ancestors, and on the combinations go. This is a dramatic impact on how we think about this question. Moving on, just for sake of time, I've got multiple, an increasing number of examples where the indigenous history of a people group matches the Y chromosome-based history. And once again, it's the Y chromosome-based history within a young Earth framework. We talked about the Bantu of sub-Saharan Africa, but there's many more. This is really exciting to me because it, in a sense, gives people back their history, where the mainstream community may have neglected it or treated it as mythological and irrelevant. And this research is giving it back. And I've had minority groups contact me and interested in finding out their history. If you're a missionary or you know missionaries and they're interested in covering the history of the people groups they're working with, again, you can send them to this website, or if eventually this goes on the internet and people watch it, and someone from a minority group is watching it, they want to participate in future research, or hey, is there already data out there for my people? Might be the question. You can email me or just send the message through the site. It'll go to my email, and we can explore these questions. Again, this is just the beginning of a whole lot of research going forward. Last 2 points, I think, should be fairly obvious by now, because I've tried to reiterate it over and over again. All of this research is being done within a 6,000-year framework, and more immediately a 4,500-year framework. If that framework is true, you should be able to see the genetic echoes of human history pop out all over the Y chromosome tree. The book has numerous examples of this. And of course, the most spectacular example is how you can see a generation by generation readout of the genealogy in Genesis 10 at the base of the Y chromosome tree. This whole book, in a sense, even though it's primarily a history book, is one long apologetic argument. It's one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. Now, the last point, which brings us back to where we started in a sense, is this whole question of why young Earth creation is still in the minority, and how this research has the potential to be a large bombshell. And I'm just going to cut to one slide here real fast, a couple of slides. If you look at, if you were to ask the evolutionary community, why isn't creation science part of the mainstream discussion, and what would it take for that situation to change? You would hear perhaps some surprises. They would say, for creation science to be part of the mainstream, it would not require mountains of evidence against evolution, because creationists have done this for years, and they've said that's not good enough. It would not require mountains of evidence for design. Richard Dawkins recognizes that the world looks designed. He said, this is a quote from his book, one of his books, "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." Dawkins says you have to deny your lying eyes and see that it's through evolution. But both of those types of evidence are not sufficient to bring creation science in the mainstream. So what is? Here's one quote. I could give you quotes over the last few decades to illustrate this point. I'll give you one. From Niles Eldredge, famous paleontologist. He wrote a book in 1982 called The Monkey Business: A Scientist Looks at Creationism. He says, creation science isn't science at all, nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. Scientific testability is the key, according to the evolutionists. That's what they've demanded. That's why this book from 4.5 years ago was written the way it was. Replacing Darwin, because I'm saying here are testable predictions that creation science makes. One of them related directly to the history of civilization, being able to read it off in our DNA. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, because now we're at a thunderstorm here in where I'm sitting, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose my connection if there's enough lightning. So, and this is a key point. I made a prediction in this book, put it in print, said we could read off in our Y chromosomes the history of civilization. This book represents the fulfillment of that prediction, and it makes many more predictions going forward about how we can read off and fill in more of the history of the globe. There's all sorts of checks and balances that this puts in place. And so my question is, in light of what's going on now, in light of what the evolutionary community has demanded for 40 years, and now that creationists are meeting that standard and exceeding it, what else is left? What I would argue is we're now at the dawn of a new era in the creation evolution debate. Creation scientists are taking the lead because the science is working. It's going beyond what evolution is doing. And we're already seeing now, and some of the critics who've begun to respond, creation scientists and evolutionists trading places. The evolutionists have demanded testable predictions for years. Creation scientists have tended to say, well, here's where evolution's wrong. They said it's not enough. Now what we're seeing is creation scientists are saying, you evolutionists make testable predictions. They're saying, well, here's why you're wrong. And I'll say that I don't care what you think where we're wrong. Give us something better. It's really remarkable to see this change take place. I'm saying all this fairly quickly just for sake of time. We could talk about it in the Q&A, but just to summarize then real fast, there are these 9 major elements of this new Rosetta Stone that are appearing. Creation scientists can now make new discoveries about the story of the history of the peoples of the world. There's new insights into so-called prehistory. We can see Noah at the base of the tree. We can see the echoes of the Abrahamic line. We can trace any single male's ancestry back to specific sons of Noah. This whole body of research fundamentally transforms how we think about race and ethnicity. There's applications to missions and to indigenous history. This is one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. And this is a major reset and table turning event in the history of the creation evolution debate in light of what the evolutionists have demanded and what creationists are now delivering. So this is the book once again. You can pre-order it through Amazon, at least in the United States. And also if you go through our Answers in Genesis store, you can call in, or, well, I guess it'd be long distance if you're in Europe, or on the web store. If you did follow this research and you followed this series we did in 2020 called A New History of the Human Race, we promised a book. This is the book that is the fulfillment of that promise. Once again, if you want to participate in future research, please go to this website. You can click on that little button, enter your information, name, email. That message goes straight to my inbox. There's also this book that is for sale. It is in print because it's from 4.5 years ago. This gets fairly detailed. I did have a pastor read through it to try to make it accessible, but it does get fairly detailed because it's designed to persuade a skeptical reader. This book, Replacing Darwin Made Simple, is, as the title suggests, a simpler version of the original book, written for believers. You can almost even use it as a tract. It's a booklet, 100 pages short. I have about a 1-hour summary of that content in a DVD called Replacing Darwin. If you subscribe to our streaming service, answers.tv, I think you'll find it on there as well, along with hundreds of other videos that are at the click of a button, sort of the Christian Netflix, in a sense, for creationist content. There's our main website. There's a bunch of other books that we have that I urge you to avail yourself of, that deal with more than I can cover just in this one talk. The larger questions surrounding the Tower of Babel. Bodie Hodge has a book on that. The questions of race and racism, Ken Ham and Charles Ware. Dr. Charles Ware is an African-American that wrote this together. We've got resources for kids. Really, the textbook of the Answers in Genesis ministry is this book called The Lie, as well as the Answers books 1, 2, and 3 that cover the whole gamut: astronomy, geology, biology, paleontology. This book, sort of the fifth Answers book, is focused almost exclusively on those questions revolving and relating to the flood and the ark and such. We have a bi-monthly magazine to keep a pulse on what's going on. This is where the organization with the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which is where I am right now speaking from here. And also about 45 minutes south of us is the Noah's Ark, the Ark Encounter. Major attractions, full-size reconstruction. It's filled with exhibits to answer questions related to the flood, the pre-flood world, the post-flood world. If you want to follow me and ask questions afterwards, again, you have that web portal that'll go directly to my email, but I'm also on social media, Facebook and other platforms. I'm grateful for your attention. I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties, and I appreciate your patience. And so I'm gonna stop here now, and we can go to a Q&A time. If you have any questions, I'm sure some have been written in, and anything that's been unclear, happy to discuss all of that. Thank you.
Okay, test. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jeanson, for your talk. Well, we should be the one apologizing for the technical difficulties. It was certainly not on your end. It was not the lightning storm, I think. But I'm sure we'll patch it up, and in the ultimate video that will appear on YouTube, the gap will be patched up. So, but we have several questions from the audience, some of them critical, I must say. So let's have a look what they say, okay? So this is a question by Fred Jacobs. I'm afraid the question only got through halfway, so I'll see what I can make of it, okay? So he quotes scripture saying that Israel would be a multitude, according to Genesis 17. There's this story about Abram having to count the stars in heaven, you know, and the sands of the earth. And I'm not sure where the question was going, but something that it made me think about was the debate that's been raging over the size of the population of the Israelites at the time of the Exodus. I'm sure you're aware of this. If you add up the numbers in the Pentateuch, then you get to a population of about maybe 2 million Israelites leaving Egypt. But then there's some discussion about the translation of the word aleph, the translation of the word 1,000 in Hebrew. So your analysis is a lot about population sizes and also population sizes in the past in the Middle East, right? So it would seem to me that your analysis would fit more with the smaller population size at the time of the Exodus, or am I mistaken about that?
There's a couple things that come to mind with that question. I'll address what you had mentioned here first, and then I'll discuss something else that may have been behind that question as well. The first thing that comes to mind is I don't know that the research yet directly addresses the question of the size of the Israelites, the size of the Exodus, size of the Israelites at the time of the Exodus. And here's why. Right now we're taking DNA from the survivors of human history. And so the first question we need to ask is, have enough Israelites survived, have enough genealogical descendants of Abraham survived to be able to address this? So one of the biblical data points that comes to mind is the tribe of Benjamin. So you think about post-Exodus, the Israelites go into the promised land. They're commanded to conquer the peoples there. They don't. They intermingle with them. By the end of the book of Judges, their whole religious system is corrupt. The priests they're getting priests to worship idols. It's just a nasty circumstance. And they're fighting each other. And the tribe of Benjamin is nearly annihilated. I think there's only 300 men left. And they have to do something creative to fetch wives for them. So that's even long before we get to the time of Christ, and of course, thousands of years before today. So whoever was from the tribe of Benjamin at the Exodus, by the time of the Judges, there were only 300 left. And all those men who would have been alive at the Exodus apparently left no descendants, it seems, by the time of the Judges. And again, we've got what? This is pre-David, so we've got 3,000 years of Israelite history left to work through and ask the question, did enough survive today for us to be able to look back in history and say how many were present then? So that was a long-winded way of saying, I don't know that this data will be able to do so. Part of the problem that I discussed in the book is for the last 1,500 years or so, the rabbis decided that Jewish identity would be determined by one's maternal ancestry, not paternal ancestry. So if you have a family where mom is Jewish and dad is not, the children are still Jewish. And what that means then, of course, is their Y chromosomes are not necessarily Abrahamic in origin. That would also play a role in diluting our ability to look back into the ancient past, the time of the Exodus. So I guess I'm saying, again, I don't know that we have the data yet. I don't know if we will ever have the data to be able to address that question. One other thing that came to mind with respect to that original question, as it relates to Israel expanding the promises of Genesis, and one thing I tried to avoid in my book was to wade into any eschatological discussion and the discussion of end times and debates over prophecies and such. And of course, when you get into questions of the covenant, you can get pretty significant differences between Baptists and Presbyterians. And so I try to stay out of any debate that divides denominations. And so I'm going to give another non-answer to that question if that was being asked as well. What is the meaning of Genesis 17? And my answer would be, it probably depends on which denomination you're in. And so Answers in Genesis and this book is probably not going to have a direct answer to it.
Okay, well, thank you anyway. You did give some big answers to several questions here. So, and I think it is indeed good to remember that this whole analysis only concerns the patriarchal lines, right? And not the lines over females, right? Over the mothers and daughters. Yeah. So people can be descended from many different ethnic backgrounds, of course, but they'll see only one of these through the purely paternal lines, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Peter Groot asks the question, is it possible, based on the Y chromosome clock, to give an estimate of the number of generations since the start of human history up until this day?
I'd say with some assumptions, yes. What you can do to answer that just briefly is sort of a very simple calculation. The average number of differences from the point that I'm calling Noah on the tree to many of the branches that are labeled T and L and R and Q and that section of the tree. It's around 440, 442 differences from start to finish. And so if you say, okay, about 3 mutations per generation, it comes out to roughly 150 generations since Noah, which that's about 30 years per generation. I think you get about 4,500 years. That seems right in line with the biblical time scale. Of course, what I've just done is a very crude calculation, because we know biblically there's some men who are very old when they father sons. Abraham, of course, being the most notable among the patriarchs. And so when I calculate an average, that's exactly what I'm doing. It's not a precise, we know how old this guy was, this guy. It's just saying, okay, in general, here's how things seem to line up. And I'd say the average calculations fit very nicely with the biblical chronology.
So the 440 mutations that on average approximately would have occurred since Noah to the present day, that's just the data that comes out of the differences that we measure that we observe today among males, right?
Yes, yes.
So the contentious part, the data is where creationists and evolutionists would agree with each other. The 4,500 years that you arrive at is of course something that evolutionists is a conclusion that they would not share. So I guess it's the 3 mutations per generation that they're going to critique. Is that correct?
Yes, some have not. You can see there's different types of responses from the critics. If you just Google or search for, do an internet search, some would say, they'll say, okay, we'll grant you the 3 mutations per generation. The problem is you're forgetting about natural selection. Natural selection would eliminate variation over time. You're forgetting about genetic drift and other evolutionary processes. And my answer would be, what testable predictions does that evolutionary hypothesis make? This is the exact same thing they've been demanding of creationists. And then I would also turn around and say, my hypothesis makes testable predictions, and we've tested them, in fact. So if 3 mutations per generation has been consistent throughout human history, then you would expect new branches of the tree to be laid down every generation. Every time a father has a son, there's a new branch of the tree. And so you'd have a very dynamic, precise way to record the ups and downs of human population history. And one of the companion papers that I published 2.5 years ago to the original paper saying the number of mutations is about 3 mutations per generation, the companion paper said, now let's look at the history of human population growth. Evolutionists and creationists would agree that from about 1000 BC up until the present, the shape of the growth is sort of a hockey stick shape, where it's fairly modest growth for about 2,400 years, and then the last 600 years, boom, it expands about 20-fold. Does the young Earth framework successfully capture that? And the answer is yes, to about 90% or more is the match. And you can see it visually. I have those graphs in the book. They're also freely available online in these papers. If you go to the Answers in Genesis Research Journal, a further prediction from that, and those were global data, a further prediction expectation from that is, what if we look at a regional scale? And in fact, one of the data sets that to me was most convincing at the early stage of this research, going back to 2017, 2018, how do we know this is actually working, was to look at the smoking gun, so to speak, the critical genetic echo for the Native Americans. We know, even mainstream scientists would say, we know that after Europeans arrived in the Americas, 80 to 90% of the native population died out. And then about the 1800s, 17, 18, 1900s, it began to recover again, depending on where you were in the Americas. You should be able to see that genetically. And I walk through how you might see this in the book. and it was seeing, it's basically, you see flat lines. So instead of someone's genealogy having a bunch of branches coming off because it's uncles and second cousins and third cousins and all sorts of other distant relatives, whole villages die out. All these distant relatives gone. And so if you're looking at the branch of the survivors of the Native American population collapse, you have long flat lines because all these relatives are just gone, dead, no descendants. Over and over again, you see that within the Native American family tree. That was another paper I published after those initial 2 papers at the end of 2019. 2020 spring is where you can see a paper on the pre-Columbian Americas, where you can see, yep, the young Earth creation model gets exactly 1492 correct when the Europeans arrive, and you can see this flat lining in the Native American family trees. You can see the recovery in the 1900s. We've confirmed this with independent data sets. And one of the true testable predictions, you could say, in terms of time. So again, I say in 2019, we've got global data. We should be able to test these hypotheses by looking at regional data. I had no full Y chromosome sequences from North Africans. We have mainstream data from history and archaeology about what North African population history looks like. And I'd expect to see that within a young Earth framework for North African genetic data. Didn't have any. By the time 2020 rolls around, we finally get access to it, and you can see that the North African history of population growth, see if I can even pull it up here and show it on the screen. It's a very tight match. I didn't know that it would happen. See if I can show this here. The tan represents the genetic data, the dashed black line represents that data from history and archaeology. Again, very tight match. And this is about as true a testable prediction as you can get, because these predictions were put in print a year or 2 prior. No idea what the data looked like. The data come out, and it was actually at that point when I saw the match that I kind of breathed a sigh of relief. I'm like, okay, this is legit. This is really working the way science should be working. And then again, going back to the question of the critics, I would say to them, give me a testable prediction. You say, what's been kind of amusing or ironic to me is, one of the main things the critics are saying is, your work disagrees with textbook science. And I would say, yes, that's what science does. It questions things constantly, and then it does experiments. And the evolutionists aren't proposing any. They're just saying it's wrong because the book says so. I'm like, that's what you accuse the creationists of doing for decades. They would say you creationists have this holy book, the Bible, that cannot be questioned. That's anti-scientific because we can never test any of these things. And here we are in 2022, and the creationists are proposing prediction after prediction and doing experiment after experiment. And the main response from the evolutionary community is, well, the book says otherwise. And I thought, well, how about that? It's come full circle. It's now the evolutionary community that is practicing religion in a sense, saying there's dogmas you can't question. There are things we cannot test or shouldn't test. And it's the creationists who are saying, no, let's move science forward and actually test these things and take nothing for granted.
Okay, well, thank you. And for the benefit of the audience, this paper also about the Native Americans is published in Answers Research Journal, correct? Which
yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that. Correct.
On the site of answersandgenesis.org. I'd like to talk a little bit more about these 3 mutations per generation, because this is also something that you defended in one of your papers in the Answers Research Journal. And like you mentioned, a response from the evolutionists is, well, hold on, we can't just extrapolate those 3 mutations per generation for 2 reasons. First of all, some of these are going to be deleterious, so these mutations are going to reduce the fitness of the individual, and therefore they're going to be selected away. And also some mutations might occur in hotspots, right? So several mutations might occur in the same place, which reduces the total number that actually occurs over time. Now, as for the first issue regarding the deleterious effect of those mutations, a response that I would give to that would be, well, if a large portion of those 3 on average mutations per individual per generation is deleterious, then that's actually going to create a problem of its own, of course, right? A sort of catastrophe error problem where fitness is declining quite rapidly. So I'm not sure that that would be something that an evolutionist would actually want to accept, that a large portion of those 3 mutations is deleterious. But how about the hotspots counter?
Yes, my response to any and all of those, because there will surely be more attempts to say, well, what about this factor? What about that factor? What about natural selection? What about genetic drift? And my answer to all of these is invoke, and to the evolutionary community would be, or to the critics would be, invoke whatever process you like. Please explain to me, in light of your hypothesis, why my hypothesis is working so well. If 3 mutations per generation is wrong, why does that model so successfully recapitulate human population growth at a global scale, at multiple regional scales? Why does it line up with known human history, known migrations in such a clear way, as I lay out in the book Traced, going region by region through the history there? Why is this so successful? That's the first response, which I have yet to hear a good rebuttal to. And the second being, anyone who wants to invoke hotspots, these sorts of things, what testable predictions does that make? Because if someone's just going to invoke natural selection willy-nilly, natural selection did it. My response would be, how is that any different from saying God did it? That's the thing that evolutionists have complained about for decades. You can't just say God did it. That's not scientific. It's pseudoscience. That would be my response. You can't just invoke natural selection, genetic drift, any of these sorts of things, unless they make clear, precise, quantifiable, testable predictions. Anything less than that, by the evolutionists' own standard for the last 40 years, is pseudoscience. So natural selection has an appeal because, oh, we understand survival of the fittest. It happens, yes. But in this specific case, how does it make predictions about the Y chromosome tree? So let me just give some examples of what's next, what's unknown going forward, what's left to discover, what are the types of data that every side has to be able to predict to claim that their view is scientific. So one of the main things that's yet to be discovered, or I should say one of the main distinguishing features of what I'm proposing, is the number of ancient branches yet to be discovered. Because of this match to human population history, where you can see this clear hockey stick shape, there's math embedded in all of that, where I can say, okay, if you take a sample of 100 men, the number of branches should come together, this many branches should come together at this point in history. And if you go back this much further, this many branches come together. Or to flip the equation around, I can say, look, at this point in history, we know there were this many people alive, yet we only have this many branches. Where are the rest of these branches? And again, I've laid this out in one of that published in growth paper. The whole history of human population growth says, okay, if I want to discover 50 ancient branches, 1,000 ancient branches, then I need to sample 10,000 men, 500,000 men, whatever the number is. There's a very clear, precise mathematical relationship between the two, and I'm already seeing that playing out in some of the papers that are being published, where they sample large numbers of men, and we discover this many ancient branches that we didn't see before. There's actually a whole thread on one of these critic sites where they're talking about an E1b lineage, the E1b1 lineage that we discussed in the lecture. I showed you a tree where it goes back. The most ancient branches were the 300s to 600s. I was arguing that this has an origin in the Arabian Peninsula. We had no branches more ancient than that before E1b1b connected to E1b1 A. Until recently, there was a deeper study of the Middle East, and they found yet another ancient branch, more ancient than 300s to 600s AD and E1b1b, and they found it in Yemen, which is exactly the geographic area where you expect to find it if my model is true. So this whole framework tells you how deep you need to look in a certain population, where you need to look for a certain population, which branches you expect to find. There's all sorts of things that play out. I have yet to see the evolutionary community come up with anything close to that sort of prediction where they can say, hey, do you want to find a deeper branch for E1b1 A? You want to find a deeper T branch? You want to find some what we call the lost tribes of Israel? Here's where you need to look. Here's how many men you need to sample. That's the type of prediction that would be science. And I'm not hearing that from the evolutionary community, which again, by their own standard, would say what they're claiming and what they're arguing as criticisms represents nothing more than pseudoscience. That may sound harsh, but I'm simply taking their own standard that they've applied to creation and applying it consistently across the board.
Right. Well, we truly live in the genomic era, and we're going to see many, many more genomes of individuals being sequenced, and of course many Y chromosomes. So I guess it's a great time in the next few years to test some of your predictions, right? But then a little bit of a critical question. Suppose your predictions are not borne out by the data. Are you then willing to say, okay, I accept falsification of my model?
Oh yes, and this has already happened. And we'll probably have a few videos about this going forward. We've already released about 5 as it relates to the publication of Traced. I haven't covered all the material, and then we're going to have a few more videos that'll finish up the material. And then I'll probably have about 3 or 4 videos that will title something like The Science of Traced, where I walk through the history of the last 12 years of the findings, the predictions, the confirmations, finding, predictions, confirmations that led up to this point, and how this all culminates. And again, at every stage then, you can go back to 2013 and a paper I published that deals with mitochondrial DNA that the critics said must be wrong. And I said, well, no, here's the data that I think underscores it, but let's take it further. And then it works again, and critics respond, that can't be possible. Well, it makes predictions, let's test them further. And this cycle continues. One of the early views I had when I was working on female inherited DNA, and then started thinking about the autosomal DNA, the DNA that we get from both parents. Didn't discuss any of that today, but do discuss it at length in Replacing Darwin. One of the early views I had that was hoping to pursue, and I hope that it would work out, was that the mutation rate for that type of DNA would be able to dial back to 0 in just 6,000 years. Well, it doesn't, of course. And when my colleagues Rob Carter was developing a model where God would have created DNA differences within Adam and Eve, and this would play a big role in how we see genetic diversity today. I was resistant to that because it just sounded arbitrary and untestable. It turns out it's not, and you can read a lot more about it again in Replacing Darwin and in some of these papers. But there have been things I've changed my views on over time because the data doesn't fit, or you just can't make it work. And so that's been inherent in all of this. And anyways, I'll probably walk through more of this history where there's been false starts and we go this way and it doesn't work out, so we have to go this way. To me, all that's exciting. And in fact, we almost had a little bit of a moment of this when people started writing in after the release of Traced. And some folks who would say, well, I've got my genealogy going back this many years, and it doesn't seem to fit the history that you're laying out. And I sort of began a little bit of an internal sweat, like, well, maybe I should have thought of this before I published this book. Here might be the falsification. But as we've worked through it, things have gotten resolved, and or are still in the process of being resolved. And one of the things I can tell myself, I guess having done this now for quite some time, in my experience, anytime you run into a contradiction, sure, there's this initial, oh no, what do we do? But scientifically, I think any good researcher knows, when you run into contradiction, these are usually your biggest helps to finding the real answer. Contradictions are never the enemy. And really, if you think about the whole peer review process of scientists evaluating work, none of them are the enemy either. Really, in a sense, the only enemy, so to speak, is the data itself. There's a way that the world operates, and we don't know it. We're trying to discover it. And the people who can ask the critical questions, or the data that shows these contradictions, are all stepping stones to get you to the real answer faster. So that's part of the reason I've put these predictions in print, is because I intend to test them. And I know that as we find contradictions or don't, or however things play out, that process is designed to lead us towards the real answer. And part of the reason I've been so confident so far and say the things I do in the book is because there is this long history of predictions, fulfillments. This model continues to work, and we'll continue chasing it until it doesn't. That's been my position so far, and I'm eager to see where it goes. I think we have enough multiple independent lines of evidence that all point towards it, that I felt confident enough to put this stuff in print, to put the credibility on the line, so to speak, and put more predictions in print. And what I've seen as things have played out, and I can add one more example here of satisfaction, I guess, or maybe sweating and then being relieved, is a conversation I was having with some Arabs who had entered their data into some Arabs who were curious about their relationship to Ishmael and Abraham. And as we were discussing, and they had entered their data into a public database, as we were discussing, they said, oh, by the way, hey, see those relatives up there on our branch of the tree? We're in contact with them. I said, okay. They said, they're cousins. I said, okay. And then we took a look at what the mainstream timescale assigned to the common ancestor of these cousins. And it was 225 years ago. I said, well, I've actually got a table, one of the supplemental tables, as a part of this book. You can find it online. You got that same website. I said, let's rerun those mainstream timescale dates through the formulas I have embedded in the tables that were part of this book. And lo and behold, you run the numbers through, you can take an evolutionary date, convert it to a young Earth relevant date, and it comes out to about 50 years ago or so. Something that makes much more sense in light of the known genealogical relationship between these two men. So that was we're sitting there in real time doing this, where I didn't know this data was out there. They brought it to my attention. I don't know that they were fully on board with what I was saying. I mean, they liked where I was going because it had implications for their own ancestry, but we were able to work through this in real time, and they were kind of smiling by the end of it, saying, aha, okay, this actually does work. We've brought you a new example that I wasn't aware of before, and it plays out the way it should. This is the type of thing that I intend to continue doing going forward. And again, we might find contradictions. I welcome them, because contradictions are a way to find new knowledge about the world. It means something I've gotten wrong, and so let's go figure out where it's right. And in other cases, this keeps working as we'd expect it to. That's satisfying and relieving.
Right. So, by the way, this test sounds like something that we can all do in our own family, right?
Yes.
So we have time for just two more questions. Someone who goes by the nickname of Grijze Kijker asks the question, is the Y chromosome completely uninfluenced by a maternal X chromosome, or rather by the X chromosome? So is there really no crossing over occurring between these two chromosomes?
There is a relationship between the two of them, and that's what's made some of this Y chromosome research challenging. And in fact, if you look at the history of publications in the mainstream literature, you'll notice there tends to be a little bit of a lag in papers on, let's say, the 99% of our DNA that we get from both parents, the autosomes versus the Y chromosomes. And part of the reason is simply the technical complexity of sequencing the Y chromosome. So let me sketch real briefly here some of the constraints that make this challenging and how this worked into how I was doing the analysis in my book. The Y chromosome is 60 million letters, bases, long. Much of that is repetitive or palindromic. Anyway, much of that sequence is almost intractable with popular sequencing methods. So just to sketch that real fast, some of the more popular sequencing methods are you take your DNA, you basically bust it up, break it up into millions of pieces, tiny little pieces. You sequence the tiny little pieces, and then you use programs to electronically stitch those tiny sequences back into a complete whole as much as possible. When you have repetitive sequences, that becomes intractable. You can't do it because you've got this tiny little sequence and it matches here and here and here and here and here and here. So where do you assign it? You can't. And so there was a paper in Science in 2013 by Posnick et al., where they essentially empirically went through the Y chromosome and said, let's do a sequencing run. Let's do these short little reads, bust up a DNA sequence, a bunch of tiny little pieces, sequence them, and say, okay, empirically, where can we reliably assign little reads back to the actual genome, and where does it not work? And the result of that was about a 10.4 million letter region, 10.3 million letter region that's been used consistently over and over again. And of course, part of what it excludes are small sections on the Y chromosome that are nearly identical to the X chromosome. Because once again, there you have another trouble. So you've got a little sequence read and it matches here to the Y chromosome and up here to the X chromosome. So where do you assign it? You need some other technology to do it. And so effectively then you just exclude it from your analysis. And so the focus of the book and much of the research of the book is analyzing just that 10.3, 10.4 region that leaves out the sections that are too identical to the X chromosome or too identical within the Y chromosome itself. You can't do that. So much of the research in the mainstream literature recognizes this and focuses on this, and I follow that same precedent to make sure we're only dealing with things for which we can speak of with a high degree of confidence.
Okay, thank you. I hope that helps. Last question asked by Veren. He asks about the ancient American civilizations such as the Olmecs, which left some sculptures which appear African if you look at those sculptures from their features. So he asks whether you discovered any connection there between those American civilizations and Africans.
Yes, this is one of the biggest research questions going forward. So let me summarize very quickly what the data that we have currently indicates about the history of the Americas before Europeans. There are two major branches right now in the Americas. Well, there's one dominant one. It's known as haplogroup branch Q. Up and down the Americas, there's a minority group known as haplogroup C. And of course, sadly, there's all sorts of European branches that are found in Native Americans because of intermingling or rape or pillage or conquest, that sort of thing. And of course, because of the ugly history of the transatlantic slave trade, you also find African branches. And just to give you a sense of this, how sad this is, the 1000 Genomes Project, published 2016 for the Y chromosome, there were around 50 men from Colombia, or excuse me, the 1000 Genomes Project tried to assess native history by taking samples from 4 American populations. They were Mexicans in Los Angeles, they were Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, Colombians in Medellin, city of Medellin, and Peruvians from Lima. The Puerto Ricans, of their 50 or so men, maybe one, you could argue, belonged to a native lineage. All the rest were African or European in origin. The Colombians, 7% belonged to native lineages. That's about it. So there's been, the Mexicans and the Peruvians were higher, maybe 20 to 40 to 50% or so were native lineages. But there's been a strong population replacement, so to speak. Okay, all that background to say, branches C and branch Q are the ones, when you remove European and African, that remain. The C appears to have arrived in the Americas from Central Asia around 1,000 years ago, 1000 AD. Q appears to have arrived in the 300s to 600s AD, so about, excuse me, about 1400 to 1700 years ago. And of course, archaeologically, the Mayan civilization had its origins perhaps 400s BC, maybe even back to 1000 BC now, based on the paper in Nature in 2020, and the Olmecs even before then. We don't have, from my perspective, a Y chromosome signature of these civilizations yet. They may not exist. Excuse me one more time. It's my after effects of a sinus infection. They may not exist because, first of all, when Europeans arrived, 80 to 90% of the native population died. So if those lineages had persisted up until that point, they may have gone completely extinct then. Secondly, before 500 years before Europeans arrived, the Mayan civilization itself collapsed, at least the lowland one did, in about the 700s to 900s AD. There were Mayan populations that persisted in the Yucatan Peninsula. However, I think their own histories talk about invasions from Mexico, which raises the question then whether or not those who survived and spoke Mayan languages descended from the invaders or from the Mayans themselves. And I think, if I understand recent history correctly, the Mayans within Guatemala today are the product of late migrations from the Yucatan down into modern Guatemala. And then, of course, the Olmecs declined as the Mayans arose. And so the Olmecs haven't been ruling anything in the Americas for thousands of years. And that raises, of course, the question whether or not we should find any signature of them. You can think of the Assyrians as an old world analogy, where they were declined about the 600s or so BC and never to rule again. And we don't yet have their lineage to analyze. What we do have is 40 million Iranian men who still live, and millions more in the other parts of the Middle East who could potentially have lineages belonging to the Assyrians. The numbers just aren't anywhere close to as good in the Americas. At its lowest point, I think there were in total perhaps just 8 million, so 8 million total people, probably 4 million men left after the total population collapse had occurred. And so is 4 million enough to have an Olmec lineage persist? I hope so. And that's part of what we're pursuing going forward. I've had a number of Native Americans write in, Christians, creationists, saying, we want to pursue this further. Part of my hope is we'd be able to uncover from their own oral histories and other histories that have been neglected, some of this pre-Columbian history that's been lost, and perhaps also in their DNA, could we find some signatures of the ancient Mayans and also the ancient Olmecs. So it's one of the hottest topics going forward. One of the questions I'd say I'm personally most eager in. If you look at the number of views of the videos that we've released, the one that has the highest number of views is the one that talks about what happened to the Native Americans. So I get the impression that there are many people besides myself who'd like to know that answer. And even the Native Americans would like to pursue this too. So I'm anxious to see where this goes. We don't have the answer at the moment, but there's a lot of data still to be uncovered.
Well, certainly fascinating. I would like to continue asking you questions, the audience as well. Unfortunately, we're really out of time, but maybe there are some possibilities that people could contact you by email and ask some more questions of you?
Yes. Again, if you go to to our website, our homepage is answersingenesis.org. And then if you just put /go, and then /traced, TRACED, the title of the book, that'll take you to the place where you can enter your comment, a question. It'll go directly to my email. And again, there's probably about 400 people who've done this already, so there's plenty of correspondence. I try to respond to all of them in a timely manner. Or if you find me on social media, there's been others who've just gone that way directly on Facebook, and then some of these other platforms like Gab and Getter and Parler. And pretty much, if there's any other platform out there, I try to sign up for it because I don't know which one is going to survive and be pursued by a number of people. So I also recently have a Twitter account, though I haven't done much on it. I had to sign up for Twitter because that was the place the Arabs wanted to have the discussion. So created a Twitter account in the last few months. So plenty of ways to contact me. Would love to hear from anyone else who wants to ask questions, critical questions. All those are fine. And of course, we'll be releasing more videos relating to the content and responses to the critics in the coming weeks and months.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you'll hear from some of us. So if you get some email from the Netherlands, then it might be related to this stream. So thank you a lot for joining us tonight, Nathaniel. And I will close off now in Dutch, if you don't mind. So
thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Ja. Nou, hartstikke leuk dat jullie gekeken hebben. In het begin was eventjes een probleempje ook met de audio toen we het hadden over het boek van Dr. Jeanson. Zijn boek Traced is, de papieren gedrukte versie is momenteel uitverkocht, maar het e-book kan gekocht worden en ik heb begrepen dat er ook een luisterboek beschikbaar is. Dus check dat als je in detail informatie wil hierover en wie wil dat nou niet, want het is uiterst interessant. Goed, dat was het voor nu. Ik zou je graag nog op willen wijzen dat als jullie meer van dit soort streams willen zien, abonneer je dan op dit kanaal. Mocht je het Logisch Instituut willen steunen, dan kan dat via de QR-code die of nu in beeld is of straks in beeld komt. En via de collecte link die in de beschrijving van de YouTube-video te zien is. Verder, we hebben een aantal andere evenementen ook op de agenda staan. Volgende week hebben we een extra livestream over de Ice Age en de Bijbel. En dan hebben we Philip Bell die het daarover gaat hebben. Philip Bell is ook volgende week dinsdag op 11 mei spreker op een studiedag. En dat is speciaal voor predikanten en jeugdleiders. Dus mocht u in die doelgroep vallen, er is nog plaats. Check logos.nl/studiedag als u daarin geïnteresseerd bent. Verder op woensdag 8 juni, dan hebben we weer een livestream en dan gaat het over de vraag: hoe kun je de letterlijke lezing van de scheppingsdagen verdedigen? Met als spreker Cornelius van Dam, die onlangs een boek uitbracht In the Beginning rondom dit thema. Goed, dan, wat heb ik nog meer? Ja, dat was het. Voor meer evenementen check logos.nl en de kalender daar om alles te zien. Voor nu hartelijk bedankt voor het kijken en hopelijk tot de volgende keer.